Welcome everyone to joining us for this today at this final of 4 CERA events at Labour Connected. I'm Ken Penton, a member of CERA's National Executive and chair of the session today. This event is our virtual fringe meeting entitled Don't Trade Away Our Future, Climate and Environmental Proofing Trade Policy. We're holding this meeting with the support of WWF. Founded in 1961, WWF is the world's leading independent conservation organisation. Their mission is to create a world where people and wildlife can thrive together. CERA is pleased to bring together a cross-departmental team of Labour MPs to explore how Labour can call for an environmental and international approach to trade and how the importance of climate and nature can be brought into the heart of decision-making, both in the UK and around the world. Combining perspectives on international trade, international development and net zero will be crucial to delivering this. Our speakers will be critiquing the government's position on trade and the concerns that environmental standards will be set aside in agreeing trade deals and weakening global progress that is needed on climate. On the format today, I'll introduce our panelists in a second, who will each speak for 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll go straight into questions. So get your questions ready, and we'll try to get as many in. Please do this in the Q&A function and leave the chat box for any links you might want to share. We won't be able to bring people in for questions, and so I will ask the questions to the panelists. The session is 50 minutes and we have to finish at 5:50 p.m. The event will be live tweeted using the hashtag @CERATrade. This can be used in conjunction with the conference hashtag, which is #LabourConnected. The relevant Twitter handles for CERA and our speakers are @CERA UK, @Emily Thornbury, @Alex Sabel, @Anna McMorran, @Francis UK, and @WWF_UK. I'll post this all in the chat when I finish speaking. We're also recording this event and it will be put on our website after today for those who can't join now already have considerable interest in this subject. Normally at Labour conference would be in a packed room. There might have been a dash for the venue and for one of our speakers. Now we're glued to our screens, but the advantage is that many people who wouldn't have been able to make Labour's scheduled conference venue, my home city of Liverpool, can participate in this evening's events. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers. First off, we'll be hearing from Emily Thornbury. Emily is Shadow International Trade Secretary. She's MP for Islington South and Finsbury, and the Shadow Secretary of State, as I said, for international trade. She's held 5 shadow cabinet positions covering the briefs of Attorney General, Defence Secretary, Brexit Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and now International Trade. In her shadow ministerial role, she's left the parliamentary spotlight on Conservative inaction on climate change. In her new post as Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Emily is leading the charge to make sure that our independent trade policy as we lead the EU will not jeopardise our public services or food and labour standards. Then we'll hear from Anna McMorran, MP. Anna is MP for Cardiff North, elected in 2017. Prior to becoming an MP, Anna was an advisor to our Welsh Labour government, working with the UN to help deliver climate action in the run-up to the Paris Agreement and worked for Friends of the Earth. In her frontbench role, Anna champions international climate justice, holding the UK government to account on its actions which exacerbate climate injustice for the world's most vulnerable and who bear the brunt of the climate emergency, despite often being the least responsible. We'll then hear from Alex Sabel. Alex is Shadow Minister for Arts, Heritage and Tourism, but he's here today in his capacity as Chair of CERA's Parliamentary Network. Alex was elected MP for Leeds North West in 2017 and quickly made a name for himself as a leading voice for transformative climate policy. Last year, he set up the Net Zero All-Party Parliamentary Group to help secure a low-carbon and clean industrial and economic future for the UK, embed zero-carbon solutions and accelerate net zero growth, innovation and global influence. Alex is particularly interested in the role of devolution can play in supporting regional economic development to lay the foundation for green growth, green jobs, and zero/low carbon in industrial strategies. He's attended multiple COP International Climate Events. And then our fourth and final speaker will be Angela Francis. Angela is Chief Advisor of Economics and Economic Development at WWF. In her role at WWF, Angela provides economic advice across the climate, food and nature programme, as well as leading on trade and industrial policy for a green transition. She's a member of UCL's Green Innovation Policy Commission and the IPPR's Environmental Justice Commission. She started as an accountant in the energy industry before moving into economic development, where she spent the last 18 years. She's led on economics, worked on and strategy for the East of England Development Agency, and worked on productivity, innovation and low carbon growth in the UK and the Europe for SQW. She was regional economist and climate attaché for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in the Caribbean, and returned to the UK to be chief economist for the Green Alliance, where she led on industrial strategy, tech and the economic case for a low carbon and circular economy. So thanks. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Emily to begin her opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thank you to CIRA for holding this event, and to the World Wildlife Fund for supporting it, and thank you to all of you for virtually taking part today. This is a really important and serious issue, and it's absolutely on the edge of policy development, and it can make a real difference if we get it right, so let's get it right. I was thinking about this session today and the issues of environment and trade. It really is the opposite of what shall I say, but it's like, where do I start? Because there's so much that I want to say. And then I saw an email from the Daily Telegraph. Calm down. I don't normally take inspiration from them, but I know they had noticed that some of the questions I've been asking in Parliament about the government's action on the ivory trade. So without wanting to spoil the story that they're wanting to write tomorrow, let's just say they'd seen from the answers that I've been given that there's a pretty enormous gulf between what they'd heard from Boris Johnson in terms of his rhetoric and what the government has actually delivered. And it got me thinking that, you know, so much of the time with this government, our complaint on their environmental record is exactly that. It's all talk and no action. It's warm words and no results. However, when it comes to trade in the environment, that's when it gets even more pernicious. You know, that's when the government's record is not just disappointing, but it's damaging and it's dangerous. It doesn't just fail to make things better, it actively makes things worse. And the reason for that, as I found on a number of other issues, whether it's the abuse of human rights or war crimes against civilians, or even the protection of our food standards and NHS, this Tory government will not allow anything, I mean anything, to get in the way of their negotiation of new trade deals. And that's partly a practical necessity because they have to fill the void that they're creating after Brexit, but it's also a political decision to try and show that we can flourish outside the EU. But either way, it means that when it comes to future trade deals, environmental concerns go out of the window. So if it's joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which may well mean signing up for ISDS, which is allowing major corporations to challenge the legality of environmental regulation, then so be it. If it means that we can't ban unsustainable palm oil products imported from Malaysia, and so we can't ban them from anywhere, then so be it. And if a deal with the United States means accepting agricultural imports that UK farmers would be barred from producing because of their environmental impact, then so be it. And the examples are endless. And of course, this is not just a case of doing trade deals which will do environmental harm, but it's also a failure, an absolutely missed opportunity, if you like, to use our new trade deals to try and do environmental good in a way that a Labour government would. You know, since Brexit in 2009, the government has signed 19 trade agreements encompassing more than 70 countries, rolling over the agreements that we have with those countries as members of the European Union so that we can continue beyond the transition period. But not in a single one of those trade agreements have we negotiated a single additional clause related to environmental protection or the sustainability of production. Nor have we considered the important step of using those trade agreements to reinforce our mutual commitments to the targets agreed in Paris. To go back to the example that I gave earlier, a government that really cared about the ivory trade would sit down and negotiate its rollover agreement with Vietnam, and when doing that would insist that Vietnamese action on ivory was a condition on any treaty. But under this government, in that negotiation, it wasn't even discussed. And if we have any lingering doubt, if there was still any question about whether this Tory government sees any opportunities or feels any obligations when it comes to the environment and trade, we have our final answer in the appointment of Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott and his role on the Board of Trade. Because not just because his active denial of climate change and his passionate embrace of fossil fuels, but because he has specifically told us that when it came to trade deals, which Australia signed when he was the Prime Minister, he saw his role as making sure that those talks did not get sidetracked by discussing what he called, and I quote, peripheral issues like environmental standards. This is the guy who's going to be representing us around the world in trade negotiations. And I'm afraid this just sums up what this government believes when it comes to the environment and trade. It's a peripheral issue, which will not be allowed to get in the way, even if it means undermining our own standards and commitments. But now we know where the government stands. The question is, what are we going to do about it? You know, what are we going to do about it, both to challenge them and to set out how we would be different? That's what I'm looking forward to discussing with you this afternoon. But just on a positive note, let me add this. This government, this Tory government, may not care about the environment when it comes to trade. But you know, the Tory media does. They care about elephants. They care about food standards. They care about farming communities. And if we can get them to care about climate change as well, then we really are in business. But strange times produce strange allies, and if we want to keep the pressure up on this Tory government, then let's be prepared to apply the pressure wherever we can and take the opportunities wherever they come to show that this Labour government will be different and what we would do instead. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Emily. Really food for thought there. I'm sure we've already started to get questions in the Q&A function. Anyone who's there, please keep the chat for sharing information. If you do have a question, post it in the Q&A box at the bottom. And I'd now like to introduce Anna McMorran to speak to us.
Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks so much to Sarah for organising this event and to WWF as well for supporting it. I think it's so important that we talk about these issues, the interlink, the relationship between climate and trade. It's so important in anything we do, because we know that we're facing a climate emergency, and we also know that time is running out in which to take action. And unless we demonstrate that at the heart of trade policy, at the heart of those agreements that we make across the world, then actually we know that we're not going to be serious about tackling the greatest, deepest, most profound threat that is facing us as a world. And we know that this must be central to UK trade policy, and agreements must be used to improve environmental standards overseas, recognising also the need for equitable distribution of environmental risk. And that's where, in terms of my shadow role, I've been working as shadow minister for DFID. I'm working on creating a climate justice network across the world. And what that is doing is giving a voice to those most vulnerable communities across the world who are at the front edge of climate change. They are living those changes, whether that's rise in sea levels, whether that's small communities are almost wiped out because of horrific conditions, weather conditions, storms, flooding, whether it's a change in how they need to farm or whether how they need to work in future. And we also know that the majority of those people being hit across the world by climate change are women. It is women that are bearing the biggest brunt of climate change. They are bearing the heaviest burden. It is usually the women that are looking for the solutions. And it is the women that are finding those solutions. So my Climate Justice Network aims to give a voice to those people and feed in to Labour's policy at the heart of where we want to be in the world and how we want to create policy with trade and how we act at home in preparing and tackling the climate emergency. And we know that post-COVID, we need to build a better society, that ensuring ethical and environmentally sustainable values are at the heart, absolute heart of future trade agreements. Building back better, ensuring a more equal, fairer society across the globe, making sure that those environmentally sustainable values are at the core of long-lasting, critical legislation. And, you know, we know that, as I've said, it's the poorest, the most vulnerable across the globe, bearing the least responsibility but the heaviest burden of the climate breakdown. So by putting that back at the heart of our policy, of our trade policy, and ensuring there's a rebalancing, putting justice, fairness at the core of future trade agreements, we make sure that those people are justly looked after, that there's a transition and that we care. And I think one of the biggest issues for future trade agreements is whether, and one of the biggest questions is whether we put the Paris Climate Agreement and compliance with the Paris Climate Agreement as a red line for future trade agreements. And that is going to be a question that I hope that we will make sure that we are asking as we are looking to this UK government and scrutinising this UK government that talks the talk, but definitely does not walk the walk. All too often we're hearing big announcements, great rhetoric from this government without delivery, and falling woefully short on its global responsibilities. Climate justice must be a human right in the same way that we should be striving for conditionality on human rights for future trade deals. There should absolutely be conditionality for climate justice. It must be interwoven into the fabric across the world, making that argument, defining it and putting it into law. So a legislative base on which to make decisions. And in Wales, I'm really, really proud that we've got the Future Generations Act, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And that acts as a legislative base on which public bodies make decisions on sustainability. So those kind of laws, that stringent look at how we act in the world needs to be part of our base. And there have been so many missed opportunities to future-proof once in a generation legislation. The Environment Bill, was I muted then? I think the host, can you hear me?
Sorry, I muted you by mistake. It was an error. Forgive me.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I was thinking, okay, is this a way of telling me to shut up? Which well, I will do now. I promise.
Yeah, I did say 30 seconds, but actually, this was me. It's the first time I've ever chaired a Zoom Fringe, so I've just led not to press the wrong button. But if you want to wrap up next few.
Yeah. I'll wrap up. So just to wrap up then, we are seeing staggering hypocrisy from this UK government, touting climate leadership, yet funneling billions in public money into fossil fuel projects overseas, exacerbating climate injustices, such as the Mozambique pipeline, for example. No decisions made on that. COP26 is an opportunity now. We host it. Let's put it right and let's see that leadership.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I think it's really important the point you made about the gender impact and imbalance on women of climate change. And also, I was really pleased to hear you say that Paris compliance in trade deals is going to be a really big issue for Labour, because we've got the scientists are telling us we need to adhere to the Paris Agreement Paris Agreement goals, and actually the government at the moment doesn't appear to be adhering to that and giving very little emphasis to that. I'd now like to invite Alex Sabel to speak. As I said, for those of you who were early on, Alex, as well as being a shadow Labour frontbencher in the Culture, Media and Sport team, is also chair of the all-party Net Zero Group and also chair of the CERA Parliamentary Network.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks to Ken and Sophie for organising the session today. It's been a great programme for CERA, and also thank you to WWF, who do a lot of work with, particularly on the Amazon, and actually bringing in trade restrictions on Amazonian goods, ones that are the product of deforestation, are hugely important. The current EU-Mercosur trade negotiations have raised serious questions for exactly this reason. Angela Merkel said, as to where the implementation agreement, the intended spirit, would be guaranteed at present. So she's obviously put a line across Bolsonaro that they won't finish the deal with all of Mercosur because of what's happening in the Amazon. And the UK also needs to put the Amazon at the centre of any UK-Brazil trade deal. Harking back to Emily's conference speech last year, we have all these strong men around the world. They're a huge, probably the biggest threat to the climate, and we need to use progressive trade policies to try and combat them. Whether this government will is obviously highly doubtful, but I think Emily's track record shows that she will, and she certainly will when she's Secretary of State for International Trade in the future. I have to say I'm not an expert in this area, although as a member of the Environmental Audit Committee, as well as all the other things that Ken said that I do, we do sometimes look at aspects of trade policy. But before I was an MP, I was quite heavily involved in the campaign against TTIP. And TTIP created a clear and present danger in the environment. It was clear that investment chapters and use of investor-state dispute settlement in TTIP would allow companies to sue governments for measures taken to support climate goals, such as the denial of a permit to construct an oil pipeline and state subsidies for solar or renewables, which are now real dangers actually for the UK in our trade negotiations. It's also true that no trade deal currently in force contains any binding commitment to ensure that international trade supports climate targets. And that should be the goal of all Labour and socialist and progressive governments for COP26 next year. And we, as the opposition party, need to be putting pressure on the government in that regard. And I think that, that is part of the role of actually the Net Zero Party Parliamentary Group. And we do have some support, I have to say, in some unusual places on the other side of the aisle. But I'm afraid the world trade system exposes the inherent contradictions at the heart of capitalism. Global trade has enshrined the principle that all other policy measures must not unnecessarily restrict or create obstacles to international trade. Second, and in stark contrast with climate agreements such as Paris, all trade and investment agreements are both fully binding and enforceable. The WTO needs root and branch reform around climate goals. Snake is eating itself, as rising temperatures and sea levels and loss of ecosystems will have a much bigger impact on global trade than any of these trade deals. They're merely man-made constructs in the face of our climate. But the area that I do know a lot about, and the Environmental Audit Committee did an inquiry on, is export credit guarantee system, and that comes under Emily's remit and the International Trade Department. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that before Ken mutes me when I've got 30 seconds to go. So my committee found that the 2.6 billion, which the UK Export Credit Agency funding spends on energy exports, that 96% was funneled into fossil fuel projects between 2013 and 2018. And only £200 million, which I know sounds like a lot, but compared to the 2.6 billion that was spent on dirty fossil fuels, only 200 million was spent on clean energy projects. And that is completely opposed to any of our climate ambitions as a nation, whichever political party we're in, even the Conservatives. What United Kingdom Export Finance is doing is locking low-income nations into high carbon dependency for years to come by removing financial risks from fossil fuel projects in developing nations. The EAC, which obviously is a cross-party select committee, at the time chaired by Mary Craig, who was a Labour MP, and now chaired by Philip Dunn, a Conservative MP, but who also agrees with the findings. The EAC believes it's unacceptable at any time when we've legislated for net zero by 2050. So it's a completely unacceptable practice. You know, I don't even believe in net zero by 2050. I'm still a 2030er. The EAC found differences in how the UK Export Finance Agency allocates overseas funding between developed nations and developing nations. During financial year 2017-18, 96% of the agency's energy support for high-income countries went to support renewables, whilst proportion for low middle-income nations stood at just 0.6%. So what we're doing is we're locking those nations into using oil and gas, and effectively they're going to have stranded assets in the future, and there are assets they don't really want or need. The EAC is recommending that the government should introduce a 5% cap on lending to fossil fuel projects through UKEF. I mean, even that for me is too high, and I don't know whether Emily's looking at this area, but, you know, we should have a complete moratorium in my view, but we're a cross-party committee, so, you know, you have to give a bit of a break. And that should be implemented as soon as possible, with a view to removing them from its portfolio entirely. These moves, which the committee claims, could help UKEF align its work with achieving net zero for 2050, which is something that we are absolutely obliged to by law. The EAC also calls for UKEF to report on the forecast and actual emissions of all energy projects it supports, both separately and as a portfolio total, because these really should be considered part of our domestic carbon emissions, not as those of those nations, because we have effectively paid for them. In order to ensure that UKEF moves away from high carbon projects and does not impact economic and social sustainability, the EAC is additionally recommending that UKEF publishes a statement outlining how it will support a just transition. That was, you know, over a year ago if that's that, and we still have had nothing. Government claims. Is that it?
So you just wrap up.
Yeah, I'll just wrap up. I was just on my last sentence actually, so that's great. So we just say that UKEF should complement its work and align with the UN SDGs, and that should be done really by the time we enter COP26 next year.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I say I was loath to cut in there because in my day job, I work for Global Witness as a climate campaigner, and my colleagues have been, Adam McGibbon has been working with a coalition of NGOs on UKEF, and you know, I was glad to hear Anna mention it in her contribution, and hopefully it may well come up in the Q&A session. But I'd now like to bring in Angela Francis, Angela from WWF, who kindly are supporting today's event. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. So Angela, I'd like to, if you'd like to speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll go straight into the Q&A. And if you've got any questions, please post them in the Q&A function below the screen. Angela.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you to Sarah for the sessions you've held today. And this one particularly, I very much concur with all of the speakers' remarks that this is a really important issue, and one that sometimes, because it's a bit technical, can be overlooked, but very important for the UK's environment commitments. So I want to, as I go through my remarks, I'm going to say quite a lot about food and farming. That's not the only trade issue, but it's one, like Emily just suggested, that is very understandable and one that captures the media, and it has already captured the media. Very important for, I think, for moving the Conservative Party in government on some things I don't think they have fully thought through, and that they need to be encouraged to think through as we proceed through trade deals. So I think food and farming proves a principle for other sectors. that you can't ask producers to invest and innovate and go further towards highest environmental standards, as we're asking our farmers to do, and then reward the producers of the worst type of production from another country by giving them access to your markets. It doesn't work, and it completely undermines the confidence of those businesses that are investing. So if we are talking about greening our economy, we have to talk about doing that in a way that really is making a transition, supporting the workers and businesses in that industry to transition, and not just offshoring our emissions to somewhere else. So it's making sure we're looking at production and consumption. So we need to look at our whole footprint, not just because we are responsible for our footprint, but also you cannot reduce your emissions and improve your nature production at home unless you're looking at the consequences overseas. So yeah, I think food and farming is the canary in the coal mine for trade, and everybody, other industries which have got tradable goods which move across borders, industrial goods, steel, should all be looking at the conversations that are happening around food and farming. So I'll start my kind of comments on this by saying that environment and economic conversations are inseparable. We've known that for some time. The solutions for the environment mean that we have to change our whole systems of production and our whole systems of consumption and bring them within planetary boundaries. The solutions for the economy are also about addressing flatlining wages and productivity, about addressing probably 50 years of no really improvement in well-being. These are big problems, and those, in my view, are about investing in the green economy. So they both help each other. It's about a future of producing things that actually reduce floods, reduce air pollution, reduce congestion, reduce waste. These are the places that we will be earning our money in the future. And that's even more true now with the economic recovery that will follow COVID. The whole economy needs to start, we need to invest in the whole economy across the country, and we need to make sure that the next 10 years really count for climate and nature. And so in that context, how do we judge a good trade deal? It's got to be a trade deal that's actually contributing towards a just transition. It's got to be contributing towards making that transition. Otherwise, it is not a good trade deal. These are not notches on a bedpost. It is not great to have, 10 notches and not be able to say how good they were. What have they done for you? How have they contributed to our economic growth? A green recovery is what all of the economists, finances and bankers have said is the most efficient recovery. It is the one that will encourage the most private investment. It has the biggest multiplier. It delivers the most jobs. So this is not just my preference for a green recovery. This is the best recovery that we will have. And so your trade deals have got to underpin that. And I don't think this is a controversial statement. I think it should be a very unifying position. And it's incredibly important that we reach people, whether they voted leave or remain, and talk about the fact that they didn't vote for lower environmental standards, and they certainly didn't vote to put the economy on the back foot in the industries of tomorrow. Those are where our jobs are coming from. That's where the jobs of our sons and daughters, new jobs in manufacturing are going to come from. And this is really critical, I think, for this conference, is that the trade deals that get signed now will not be undone in 5 years. If a trade deal is signed that takes us in the wrong direction, that is permanent. These deals are permanent. And I think we've seen from the Internal Markets Bill conversation that international law is incredibly powerful. As Alex said, it is enforceable. If we sign up to the wrong deals that get in the way, that is a big problem. So I'm really interested in talking to Labour Party conference about what can we do in terms of encouraging cross-party support for things that we know are supported across Parliament. Climate change and nature and the need for a green transition is cross-party support. We just now need to show why trade deals, if they're done wrong, could get in the way of that, and make sure that we bring as many Conservatives and other parties with us to say we can do this in a better way. So yeah, we really need MPs of all stripes to ensure we don't rush into trade deals that take us in the wrong direction. So the two things I would say about this are we need to look at scrutiny and we need to look at standards. And I can say more in the questions, but essentially modern trade deals are complicated, and we are not going to get the right type of provisions in terms of ensuring that we look at the precautionary principle, we look at food standards, we ensure we have the ability to regulate in the future. We're not going to look at the impacts of the trade deal on different sectors and different regions if we are not taking those deals through Parliament and they haven't got a full assessment. That is absolutely paramount in getting any good trade deal. And it's what every leading trade nation does. It's what the US does, it's what the US is doing now, and it's what the EU does. most powerful trading nations take their deals through Parliament, and we should be doing the same. And on standards, standards are an important tool for our economy. They are not holding us back. OECD evidence shows that the countries that have got the most stringent environmental regulations are the countries that are investing most in R&D, and they've got the biggest improvements in productivity. So undercutting our standards is not a solution. I'll just be very quick, Ken. We are at a crossroads, I think, essentially, where you're deciding between industrial agriculture or agroecological agriculture. We're deciding between high carbon industry or low carbon industry. BP have already announced they're going to be cutting oil and gas production by 40%. Countries all over the world are increasing their regulations for green power, for transport, for heating and cooling. All of the legislation is moving in the direction of green industries, and it will be just insane of the UK, where we're leading, particularly on farming, and we've got the Climate Change Act, to start taking a step back and put ourselves in a place where we can't carry on leading and take industry forward. So yes, trade policy is absolutely critical to environment. It is critical to economic policy, and we need to show where it's contributing and its scrutiny. And this is, I think, something that has got widespread popular support. This is not an elite issue. The public care about standards. They definitely care about food standards. And this, if we can make it a conversation with the Conservative Party, is one that is definitely winnable, in my opinion.
Thanks very much, Angela. Two things that what jump out at me. One, you said about trade deals being incredibly complicated, and I think that brings up the issue of competence and the competence of our governments and individual ministers and their envoys to be able to negotiate those deals. But also the point you made about standards and people caring about standards, and that brings into our first question, which is from Sandy Martin, who's a fellow member of CERA's executive. And he's aimed at Emily, but I think maybe Emily and Angela might want to come back to this. And Sandy's asked, if we continue to maintain environmental standards for agriculture and industry in this country, why would we allow those standards to be undermined for the production of goods in other countries to be imported into this country? Doesn't that undercut good practice in this country? Emily? You need to unmute yourself, Emily.
Yeah. Okay. You're going to need to stop me, Ken, because this is kind of like an issue that I've been fighting on quite hard, and it's really important. And I pick up in a way some of the things that Angela has been saying.
I should have said, forgive me, we've got 11 minutes left for this meeting. So
Okay. All right, then let me go fast. I'll go fast.
20 seconds, Emily. 2 minutes.
No, I'm not doing 30 seconds on food standards or an environmental. I'll tell you this, right? That the truth of the matter is that we do have higher food production standards on many levels, whether it's animal welfare, whether it's environmental standards or anything else, than, for example, the United States. And one of the things that the Brexiteers have wanted to push is you'd leave Europe, fall into the arms of the United States. And this is not just about chlorinated chicken. This is about a great deal more. This is about essentially saying to our farmers, we may have stopped you having sow stalls. We may have expected you not to use pesticides. We may have expected you to have much higher production standards. But what we're going to do is have a deal with the United States. The tariffs will be lower than they were when we were in the European Union, and therefore all their cheap goods can wash into Britain. And we will say to our farmers, you can go out of business or you can lower your standards. And actually, we will be losing a great deal from that. Now, the problem is in the environment of trade is that actually there are very few precedents for having a trade deal where you're saying more than you're not allowed to buy this food because it isn't safe. So chlorinated chicken and hormone injected beef are excluded from Europe because of safety. We want to go further than that and not just talk about safety, but talk about food production standards. And the difficulty is the WTO is a long way behind on this because that was created 30, 40 years ago. We need to update the international order on this. So it's a big campaign. There is a precedent that I've found, and I'd be interested if Angela has another one. When the European Union did a deal with South America on food, they had in their trade deal about South America not being able to export battery hens and eggs, and that was food production standards. It wasn't about safety. So these things are shifting. The world of trade is shifting, and what you can expect by way of examples is shifting. And of course, there's also the example of what New Zealand is doing, where they are getting a gang together and they're saying, we want to, through trade, start developing policy whereby we can fight climate change. We can actually move forward together, and we should be in groups like that and working collectively and multilaterally in order to maximize our voice and to be a force for good in this field. Sorry, much longer than 30 seconds, but that's my fastest I could answer that question.
That's absolutely fine. I actually said 90 seconds, but
Okay, good.
But also, I've now been told we can run on to 6 o'clock if everyone's okay with that. So we've got a little bit more time. Angela.
Yeah, I just to add, I mean, totally agree with what Emily described there. It is a new and evolving space to try and work out environmental standards, but the WTO have signaled that they are willing to start looking at that in a more expansive way than they have hitherto. And the UK, with the Climate Change Act, with a evolving public money for public goods farming system, is the perfect country to start expanding the envelope. So I find it really interesting that, having removed ourselves from the EU jurisdiction, and so pleased that we are going to be able to set our own rules, we are jumping into bed with the US and very willing to have the rules from Washington, which on farming are very much worse than ours. It is not an advanced nation on farming. It is not doing the things that we need to do to move towards agroecology. And I think the thing that is coming to the point that Anna was making around international justice, if we are going to say to Brazil, you can't export from deforested areas, we want you to move towards sustainable agriculture, we have to be even-handed to the richest country in the world that has the perfect version of the most industrialized conventional agriculture system, the most pesticides. We can't say to America, you're fine, but we're going to place restrictions on Brazil, because it's not just about stopping deforestation, it's about starting sustainable agriculture. We're starting it in the UK, and we have to say we don't want the old version from the US, we don't want it from Australia, we don't want it from New Zealand. All those countries need to start doing better, and we have to start asking them. They can all farm differently. There
are other precedents when it comes to food production standards, and that's organic food. So there is trade happening on the basis of food production standards. We just need to start expanding that, using that as our platform, and saying we can move on from this. That's why actually, I mean, all the people on the call that I know, we all fought very hard to stop Brexit, and we think that it is generally a major negative. But there are one or two positives, and one of the positives is that we could start developing our own trade policy, and that it could be a positive thing and it could be a good thing internationally if we did it right, and if we had some vision.
The EU will struggle to move on CAP as quickly as we've moved on farming, and if we're going to do anything for the environment, we should do it in food and farming. Our farmers have moved enormous amounts to start to say that they're going to move towards net zero farming. They've embraced high standards as their brand and their source of competitiveness. We need to support that, and it's the same for every industry. We can't ask steel producers to do more and invest and then undercut them. It's the same story, and I think it's a principle of effective policy, that if you start to ask your industry to do something, your trade policy has got to be behind it.
And what's interesting is that when we had the petition, you had environmentalists and farmers and consumer groups all working together and getting a petition of 1 million people, signing a petition on food standards. I mean, unfortunately, the National Farmers Union then got bought off by the government far too cheaply, in my view, because in the end, what we need to have, as you said, is we need to have a trade policy which is properly democratic, where people will be listened to, where it isn't just Whitehall knowing best. We don't have our trade deals signed up by one or two individuals in Whitehall who don't know, who need to learn from the public and need to learn from the experts, so that we can have real trade deals that are reflective of our values and progressive and can go forward. But the Tories are fighting tooth and nail to stop any sort of democracy, which means that we as a Mother of Parliament, instead of increasing our democracy, are a joke. We have a deal with Japan, but we can't show the details yet because the Japanese Parliament's got to look at it and sign it off, whereas our Parliament doesn't have any say at all. And the same with the Australians, the same with the Americans, any of these countries that we're dealing with, they have democracy and we don't have democracy. And we have a government with no vision on this issue. I'll shut up now, Ken.
Okay. I mean, can I bring Anna, as we've got a bit more time, can I bring Anna in on this?
Yeah, thanks, Ken. I agree with everything that both Emily and Angela were saying just then. We have to reflect our trade policy here at home. We have to be putting good practice here and then have that reflected in our international policies across the board. And we do need to start at home. So we do need to be carefully stipulating what that is going to be and the red lines. As I mentioned in my opening, we need to set those red lines very clearly. And that for me would be, and for Emily, and the Labour Party are the Paris climate agreements, and not exceeding 1.5 degrees. Those are the very limits that we need to be looking at, and therefore all that follows. And you're talking about agriculture, food standards, and that actually leads on to what we've been discussing in Parliament over the last couple of weeks, which is the Internal Markets Bill, and our relationship then with trade agreements, but our standing in the world, but importantly, how standards differ amongst the countries within the UK. So what this bill does actually is it's essentially a power grab from the devolved governments. So from Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, who now actually set higher standards or would want to set higher standards than England, and who do in many, many areas. What this might be is a power grab back to Westminster, away from devolution. So that's a whole other issue and topic that we could talk about for forever. But it's a really important point when we're talking about trade policy and setting standards and the implications and the impacts here in the UK.
Right, thanks for that, Anna. And I think we've got another question here from Fabian Breckles, which I'm going to put to you, Alex, first, and maybe then to Emily. I don't know if we are looking like, unfortunately, we are going to be out of power till 2024 unless something happens. We're going to have a Conservative government, and if they do make trade deals along the lines that we fear, and they ignore the environment, how, if and when we hope we get a Labour government, how can we revise them and how can we change them? Fabian asks, will it be too late? Alex?
It's a good question. And so my limited knowledge of international trade law, basically, if both parties want to renegotiate the trade deal, then they can. So for instance, if we win power in 2024 and the Workers' Party in Brazil has won power, then I imagine we'd both want to, if the UK and Brazil had got a trade policy, then would want to renegotiate it and put quite heavy and stringent environmental clauses in it. However, if we're in a trade deal with a country where we have a fundamental disagreement, they like the trade deal and we don't, then our only real option is to withdraw from the trade deal and go to WTO, which is obviously not a great option. So, I mean, the solution is that we need socialist governments elected everywhere, so that we can then renegotiate better trade deals with them. I mean, the other option is probably one that I probably don't want to get into in terms of our relationship with the EU. But I think that's it really. If we've got a like-minded foreign government, then we can renegotiate, and if we don't, we can't. I think that's the top and the bottom of it, I'm afraid.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, but I think also what we also need to be mindful of is this, right? And I don't know, nobody seems to have even told Liz Truss this, or if they have, she's had her fingers in her ears going la 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 la. Comprehensive trade deals take years to negotiate. You can't just have a quick and dirty trade deal with Donald Trump before he loses office. Not a comprehensive trade deal. You might be able to have a bit of paper you can just wave around and claim that it's a trade deal, but a real trade deal, like the one that we have with the European Union, or we used to have with the European Union, takes years to negotiate. So the truth is that we're unlikely to have got any of these sorts of trade deals that they're talking about, the new ones, so like the ones with Australia or New Zealand or America. There's 2 lots of trade deals at the moment, just to give people this information. So obviously the biggest trade deal is with the European Union, where half our trade is. And to a certain extent, when the government are talking about trade deals at the moment, they're doing a bit of kind of magician stuff. You know, they're waving their hand up over here going, look, 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 a deal with Japan, a deal with Japan. But actually what matters is what they're doing with the European Union and not getting a trade deal with the European Union in half our trade. It's not to say that a trade deal with Japan isn't important, but frankly, it's only like the equivalent of a third of the amount of trade that we do with the Netherlands. So, you know, and we have a trade deal with the European Union, and then we have a series of trade deals that we've had with other countries that have come as a result of being in the European Union. So, you know, so we may have had a deal with South Korea because of being in the European Union. So when we leave the European Union, how do we continue to trade with South Korea? The problem is that we've only managed to agree half of those, what they call rollover deals, with the countries that we already were supposed to have trade deals with. They've only managed to organize half of them, and we've still got half the deals to do, and the big one with the European Union. So we're in really deep shit when it comes to negotiating on trade. But that's, you know, by the by. They still seem to think that they can click their fingers and Donald Trump will give them a trade deal before he leaves office, we hope, in November. So, you know, let's talk truth here. And there's a question in the chat and in the Q&A, which is, if it's such a great deal that we can have, great thing that we can have our own independent trade policy, why do we give it over to Europe? I mean, the downside of the Europeans being responsible for our trade policy is that it was big and clunky, and you know there were lots of kind of compromises. For example, with Colombia, there's a trade deal with Colombia where I know there was a big fight, where they wanted to have with the EU trade deal with Colombia that there had to be proper respect for human rights and support for the peace process. And obviously, given that the government has now been taken over by a political party that was against the peace process, it's quite important to have to hold them to account somehow internationally. And so the trade deal was thought to be a way of doing that. But all that they did in the end, in their compromise, was they had human rights monitors and a roadmap, but no connection between the two and no enforcement. So, you know, it doesn't necessarily, because it's a big and unwieldy kind of block, it has to compromise sometimes, and it doesn't necessarily always come out with the right stuff. The advantage, the obvious advantage, is that when you're negotiating with America or anywhere else, you can say, we're part of the biggest trade bloc in the world. You know, what do you want? You know, leave us alone. Don't try and bully us. You know, and in the end, what's happening is that more and more countries are getting into trade blocs, and essentially the way that trade is going is that people are being asked to pick a side. You know, are you part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Are you part of the European Union? Are you in the American sphere of influence? You know, it's just, you know, things are getting bigger and bigger, and it will be hard for us. And the only way we're going to be able to survive is by being smart. It's by being smart and by making friends and alliances and by being progressive, in my view.
And can I just come in on that, actually, Emily, just to reinforce that point, having been in the room at COP, previous COPs, in the negotiating room, at the table, it is because the EU is one of the biggest blocs in the world that we managed to get the Paris Climate Agreement. And the EU was looked up to, and people sat and listened. China sat and listened. The biggest countries in the world listened. So we need to remember that. And as we go it alone, and as we try and negotiate a deal with the EU, we need to remember, you know, actually, we're better off together in this world.
Can I jump in, Ken?
Sorry, well, Angela, I was going to bring you in, but also ask you to segue into a question we've had from Marion Williams as well. Marion says that my fear is that we live in a world of dependence on food banks, and we're facing unprecedented unemployment and homelessness, presumably as you know, the impacts of COVID on our society and our economy. And how will we feed our people with higher and realistic prices for food?
Yep, that's a great question. Thank you, Marion. So just very quickly wanted to say on trade deals that although it might be possible to renegotiate in the future, and we certainly should, I'm really keen to focus on how we work cross-party to avoid signing up to bad trade deals now, because although a good trade deal takes a long time to write, you can sign up to a bad one quite quickly. that is unfortunately maybe what might happen. And I think it's an incredibly bad signal ahead of COP that the UK doesn't start putting its economic interests and its trade policy in line with the direction of greening. So, I mean, for all the reasons for our own economy, but actually as a signal to the world that the UK is going to, in its first sort of independent acts on policy, starting to go in the wrong track, is just incredibly damaging for the whole climate process. So, I think the plea is not to wait, and we must make sure that the strong feelings that are in business and in the public and amongst parliamentarians on all sides are heard, and that we don't take a wrong step. It is easy for us to carry on negotiating and make sure that the deals we get are good, and that is a better outcome, and we should congratulate the government for that, and not for the numbers of deals it does. So a good deal with Japan or a good deal with New Zealand is better than a quick deal with the US or a quick deal with Australia that's bad. On the food point, Marion, yes, I think there's a lot, I think, of concern in the environmental sector that the arguments that are made for free trade deals are that we get cheap food, and that is something that would be good for the general public. I think we know already that the UK has got some of the most affordable food already in the world. So I think food, I was looking at this in a report that was comparing food prices over the two jubilees. So 1977, we used to spend 25% of our income on food, and in 2010 we spent 15%. And that's a bit more for the people in the lower socioeconomic groups, but it's low. And the issue we have with food poverty is poverty, not the price of food. So we've got a poverty issue, and we've got an issue that we need to address there. And you know, in the same way as when somebody can't afford their electricity bill, you give them a winter fuel allowance. You don't try and bring all the electricity prices in the whole country down, because that ruins all electricity. So think about how we tackle the problem appropriately. I'll let Emily come in because she's waving on this one.
Sorry, and you were talking about food, and one of the really interesting aspects of the food standards campaign is the work of Which and the polling that they have done of consumers. And it's, we might feel that that, for heaven's sake, we have such poverty, we have people who are hungry, who are not being fed properly. What are we doing making food, getting in the way of food becoming cheaper? It isn't the cheapness of food, it's the standard of food, and it's eradicating poverty is what we need to do.
Yeah,
and actually, when you poll the public, they don't want the cheaply produced food. And so so you'll get an argument back from a Tory who'll say, oh, it'll be fine then, we'll just get it labelled. But of course the truth is that the food that you get in institutions, in schools or in hospitals or prisons or wherever, you don't know where the food comes from, where the chicken comes from, where anything else comes from, and also in takeaways. And so actually the amount of time, the amount of opportunities that people will have to look and to read the labels, are limited. And in reality, how often do people really need to? They want to be reassured that the food that they're getting, that the pork that they're getting, is not produced by a pig who has never been allowed to turn round. They do not want to buy pork of that sort. They do not want pesticides on their food that is marginal. There are marginal arguments about whether or not they're actually fundamentally bad for them, let alone what they're doing for the environment. The truth is, that's what the polling says, and we need to, and this is not a class issue, we need to be clear about that. It cuts across class. This has been, everybody wants to be able to eat decent food, and our challenge as socialists is to make sure that there is the sort of equality that gives people access to that good food, but not to ensure, to ensure that there is cheap, unsafe food on the shelves. That would be wrong.
Thanks, Emily. We're now at 6 o'clock, and we haven't been 6:01. We haven't been cut off yet, but I fear we're about to be. I'd just like to thank all of our speakers and also to Angela and WWF for supporting this event. This is a real live issue of, as Emily just said, of importance to people. Whilst the title might seem dry, these are the big issues that affect people in their everyday lives. And it's how politics and everyday life of people intersects. We don't have the time to go into it now, but it strikes me as something that we're going to be debating in coming days, weeks, months, and years. And I think it's something Syria is going to be looking at further. And I think we might be looking to do more events on it and more publications on it. And I hope that all of our panelists would be interested in joining in on that. Thanks very much for taking part in this evening's event. If this was a real live meeting, I'd let the discussion go on and we'd get more questions from the floor. Although at the end of a 4-day conference, people might be somewhat jaded. But, I think what's come through is that what we need on international trade from a Labour perspective is that we need to reflect the issues that are important to people in their everyday lives. We need to stand up for principle, but also connect our messages to them. And we need to challenge the competence or the incompetence of our current government to be able to negotiate on the big issues that affect our country now and for long into the future. So thank you very much, Emily. Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you very much, Angela. And thank you very much, Alex, who's the chair of the CERA Parliamentary Network. I think both Anna and Emily are members of CERA. I'm glad to see it. Anyone watching this evening's event, if you're not a member of CERA, I did post on the chat earlier, but you can join us. And thanks very much. And we look forward to seeing you in future events.
Thank you.
Bye.